Oh, hey there. This is my final project. I'm going to be doing it over free will and moral responsibility. I'll be focusing sort of on the theistic aspect of it. In other words, predestination, which I understand is a somewhat different category. But I will just be mostly explaining my deep-seated uncomfortability with the idea of conscious beings existing in a universe where their actions are predetermined, especially in the case that that being has been created by a deity, and even more so if that entity is subject to some kind of cosmic moral law where there are deserts such as paradise or hellfire. Especially even more so if these are eternal punishments or rewards. But I will also get into non-theistic forms of determinism, which also posit, in the absence of a deity, that basically our actions, while not being predestined, are priorly determined or determined by prior factors. So, am I uncomfortable with that too? Let's find out. All right. So, human beings have found throughout recorded history, at least, that our apprehension of ourselves is multifaceted. Many texts make use of a multiple-tiered understanding of what a human being is. There's the classic phrase by Ludwig Feuerbach, as related and criticized in a way by Friedrich Engels of Communist Manifesto fame. So, the quote, what's the quote? Man is half beast and half angel. So there's this primary understanding that we exist on multiple levels, that we have what many religions call base urges, the animal side, and then we have these transcendent virtues, we call them, or transcendent aspects of our thing, that of our ontology, that requires that we have something beyond the mere base. In short, what separates us from the animals, if there is to be such a separation. Okay. Certainly, it must be understood that our every action takes place in the context of the matrix of a four-dimensional space-time, three spatial dimensions and one temporal dimension, which is on the macro level, which we interact with. Here's me interacting with the macro level. Mayonnaise. Olive oil mayonnaise. It's worth the extra 30 or 40 cents, or whatever it is. IMHO. On the macro level, we interact with a deterministic system, the laws of which were laid out so elegantly by our Isaac Newton. This is an understanding of the physical world which hinges in great part on its observed compliance with the law of cause and effect. Although if you look into Isaac Newton's background and personal life, he had a heavy interest in mysticism as well, something that his acolytes nowadays may not be too keen on. Well, or maybe not. What do I know? I say observed because the physical theory has been everywhere and by all people been borne out by the evidence. For example, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The laws of thermodynamics. For instance, blast combusting rocket fuel out of the back of a nozzle at the end of an enormous metal tube, and you get liftoff. And if the scientific achievements of getting us to outer space are not evidence enough of the reality and applicability of these physical laws, I don't know what is. So, anyway, us being enmeshed in what have to be physical bodies, unless this is all an illusion, themselves enmeshed within a three-dimensional matrix, which we call space-time, it's therefore unsurprising that modern philosophy, being thusly informed by the physical sciences, particularly classical physics, would find the need to encompass this within the overall conception of the human being. Right? Consistency. We like consistency. Yeah, to encompass the overall conception of the human being or the human condition or the reality of the human species, although that's a little more biological than I meant to get. It seems as this deterministic picture of macrophysics required the reevaluation of the will and the prospect for freedom, or it seems that it did. The historical survey is not what this piece is about, but so long as we're talking about the potential for less than conscious chains of cause and effect, we have to at least mention the historical context of the debate, which is kind of our memory of a chain of cause and effect. So we've got the Godfather, that is Rene Descartes. You know what I'm talking about? He emphasized the primacy of the mind and of self-awareness. You know, knowing the self via the self. I think, therefore I am. He arrived at this through a process of skepticism, in the old sense. How do we know what we know? That is, he interrogated every belief he had until he could come to something that he thought was, you know, ground level. And what he came to was that I think, therefore I am. That I am a mind, and I am thinking, and that is something I cannot doubt. Whatever else I think, that I'm thinking is a fact. That's Descartes. Then you got Hegel. We'll call him the cool uncle. Supremacy of interaction. So he believed that the self could only be understood through a dialectic, a process of back and forth between the self and the other. And he had this whole thing about, you know, the self and the other, the master and the slave, and his whole bit about that. I'm not quite super interested in that right now. That's not what I'm talking about, but basically let's call it reflective awareness, knowledge of the self as a result of reflection from other minds. Yeah, this could be a side note on the historical aspect. These ideas are becoming current. Descartes and Newton, if I'm not mistaken, were at least quasi-contemporary. So these things were kind of being informed by the physical science. While the evidence for the deterministic four-dimensional cosmos seems incontrovertible, it leaves us with a conclusion which sits somewhat bitter in my mouth. That is, we seem to be led, in my case unwillingly, down a logical algorithm towards an answer that produces in me a sensation of existential, to use the term loosely, somewhat loosely, incorrectly, whatever, existential horror. Why should it bother me so? Why does this idea get so under my skin? Well, another brief historical note, albeit one with a more personal emphasis. As you may have heard me mention once or twice, once upon a time, I entangled myself in a certain prominent world religious tradition, one with a particular emphasis on the absolute oneness, singleness, solitariness, and absolute primacy of that almighty prime mover. In this view, it is a definite fact that everything we see around us, ourselves included, is literally predetermined. And I use the term literally. That is, the traditions relate that all temporal existence, and non-temporal existence for that matter, is actually written out in something called a book. Yeah. This is not an altogether alien conception of the putative intersection between the divine and the mundane to a person steeped in a Christian-based conception of this process. Though historically it has remained a minority position in the Christian tradition. Minority position in the Christian tradition. I'm talking about John Calvin, not Alvin, not the Chipmunks. The idea of predestination give my ass the hiccups. Okay, sorry. Yeah, here I'm talking about the idea, similar idea, though admittedly distant, idea of predestiny, as I mentioned in the preface. The idea is that the primacy of God is so absolute, his knowing and his foreknowledge so complete, and his power so complete, that having another entity with any degree of power over its own fate is rendered something as seeming like a lapse in logic. If you assent to the idea that you have this prime mover, this original intelligence that is encompassing through its absolute power and absolute knowledge, omniscience, everything you're going to do before you do it, and in fact had an active role in everything you did before you did it by writing it out in this book, then also holding the idea of an independent, self-directed, free will having, even here, free choice. Like, even choice is out in this because you have no choice. What you did is predestined. It's fate. There's no getting around it. My rabbit's causing havoc. You know my mind. I'll deal with that later. However, this particular tradition has an enormous emphasis on right action, so far that some thinkers define its strictures as an orthopraxy as opposed to an orthodoxy, which is prevalent in Christianity. To define those terms, orthodoxy means right thinking. It's kind of a self-serving term introduced by the early Christian church fathers to describe their own way of thinking. Up until then, we call them the proto-orthodox because they hadn't gotten around to the deft, debate move of calling what they think right and everything else heterodox or otherwise thinking, which is really like very skillful and also cunning. And I'm like, ugh. That lacks a little bit of intellectual integrity to call your own shit right thinking and everybody else otherwise thinking. So whatever. Oh yeah, and an orthopraxy, on the other hand, would be not something that is defined by right thinking, but right practice, right action, right doing things in the right way. The outer form being what's emphasized, as opposed to assenting to a certain number of beliefs or a certain doctrinal creed. It's outwardly practicing the outward forms, the practices, the rituals in the correct way. So, with the moral code being something so highly, highly, highly emphasized in this tradition, and lots of traditions, all the monotheistic traditions have this huge emphasis on morality. That is, doing the right thing. But morality, of course, as we know in studying free will, requires the ability to have been able to do something different. Could have done otherwise. So in all of these cases, but in particular this one that I was involved with, you could not have done otherwise. And yet, the moral code still stands. This illuminates a philosophical dilemma for anyone paying attention. The prospect of eternal reward or eternal punishment seem to fall entirely flat when weighed up against the prospect of our every action having been predetermined by this omnipotent prime mover. This makes the ultimate in moral justice and preventative measures. Vice, reward, and punishment. I mean, if you have like an ultimate judge of the universe, that makes for a great, wimpy moral standard or whatever it was. Hold on, I'm pulling it up. But here, I'm not. Hopefully, this doesn't destroy it. Hold on, just gonna mess it up. Oh, I shouldn't have done this. Damn it. Okay. Yeah, it was it. Moral responsibility. Damn it. Wimpy moral responsibility. It's both, really, but it could be seen in the view of no desert, just trying to get people to do better things by threatening them with punishment or promising them a reward. Although following through and making that eternal kind of makes it bold and more that there is desert, like you deserved what he did to you. Yeah. We go up against the prospect of our every action having been predetermined by this omnipotent prime mover. This makes the ultimate in moral justice and preventative measures, well, it makes the whole project into a joke. That's what I really feel. It makes the whole project into a joke. A sick joke at that. It would mean that any individual can be looking forward to either eternal reward or eternal punishment based only on the creative whims of the author of our existence. Just as in a book that a person writes, their characters do what they wrote. The characters could not have done otherwise. The book was written that way. If the universe has a book like that, if time has a book like that, then we're characters in it. If it has an author, and we could not have done otherwise. We are at the utter whim of what was written for us in that book. How much more grimly funny would this sick joke be than if the person could be boiled alive in a river of pus forever for the sins they were predetermined to perform? And I mean this in the literal sense as well, for if our consciousnesses are at best an auxiliary which can only act with the say-so and the foreknowledge of God, then I can draw no other conclusion than to say that in this schema, the prime mover must be utterly deranged. What other conclusion can we draw? What other conclusion can we draw from a universal schema which states human beings are both subject to a moral code, an eternal moral code, an unchanging moral code, but inherently powerless to affect anything other than what was predetermined? I'm starting to smell absurdity cooking. Okay, a little thought experiment. God writes in his book that so-and-so murders such and such. This is bad, but who's morally responsible? We'd have to say the killer, right? We're looking at it. This guy killed him. He's morally responsible for that. But in this view, if this is your philosophy, if you believe in this predestination, hogwash, then we'd like to say the killer, but if his actions are written out as thus, there are no could do otherwise conditions. God ruled that out. God ruled that out. And by very nature of existence, not being anything except that God is. Let me say that again. I kind of stumbled over that. There are no could do otherwise conditions. God ruled that out. By the very nature of existence, not being anything except that God is. So, just as a book is not anything except that the author is or was, so too in this view, the universe and our lives and everything in it could not be anything except that God is. It's brought into much sharper relief here. The killer goes to hell for all eternity, boiled alive in a river of pus running back and forth between a river of boiling pus and a river of molten lead, attempting to sate his thirst at each, but finding each unbearable, running back between the two, crying out, "Would that I could change what I did," as if they had the ability to change it. So, one is burned and the other exalted for entirely arbitrary reasons. Arbitrary. Arbitrary. And kind of the definition of arbitrary is that it's not related to morals, that it's arbitrary, that it was just a choice. It had no consideration. There was nothing else. So, it's arbitrary. And there's no point to a cosmos like this. There's no point. It's a pointless. You know those Christmas train sets that just go around and around and around, and a guy spent all his time building it up, and he put the little people, and he put the little hats on them, and he painted the little snow on the fir trees, and the little thing is going around and around, and he sits back and he's like, and he saw that it was good. That's what this universe is like. So he could put in his little train set one little metal dude stabbing another little metal dude, and the dude's like, he could do that. Would we say that those little things on the board are to blame for the fact that one is killing the other one? No, that's absurd. It's absurd because he arbitrarily, and then why did he make that one be the killer and that one be the one being killed? Arbitrary. So is this. So is a universe like this. There's no point to a cosmos like this, and God may just as well have not created it. Maybe it would have been better if God would have not created the universe. If this is what the universe is like, where we are conscious entities bound to a moral code, yet are predetermined, predestined to all of the actions that we take. It's an arbitrary universe, and it's a sick joke if it's like that. We should have been made automatons. Indeed, in this scenario, if it's real, it would have been better to not create a universe, or to not create a universe with consciousness in it. A truly compassionate God, in this situation, knowing that making this world is impossible to do. If he knew that making this world would be impossible to do without sending a single solitary soul who had no real control over their actions, then it seems this compassionate God should have refrained from making the universe. No, look, I've gone on way long here. I only meant to make 20 minutes, so you know what? I'll leave it there. I did have a little bit of stuff. Okay, I'll try to do it in like 2 minutes. Okay, so forget God, forget predestination and all that bullshit, whatever. So maybe the universe, maybe we still don't have free will. Maybe all of our will is predetermined by our biology and by the confines of living in a 3D universe. Okay, so we have the thought experiment, the classic one, where, you're driving down the road, it's late at night, a person jumps out, and you don't have time to stop, you run them over. You kill them. Are you morally responsible then? Put a pin in that. Okay. You're drunk. You drive drunk. You run down the road. You kill the kid. Are you morally responsible? Put a pin in that. And then, third option, gun to your head, they make you drink and then they make you get in the car, like that movie Speed where the bus is going to blow up if they go below 60 miles an hour or whatever. They do that to you. And then you run somebody over and kill them. Are you morally responsible for that? It would seem in all these cases, most people, myself included, would say in the first case, you're not morally responsible. In the second case, you are morally responsible. And in the third case, you're also not morally responsible. In all three cases, you're causally responsible. Why do we say that? So I've been thinking about this a lot, even though, and it shows that it's not the drinking It's not even necessarily drunk driving, and it's not necessarily the killing of the kid that is the wrong thing. There are, and I hate to make recourse to, society again. It's like I'm exteriorizing it again, making it not about the self, even though my thing is all about freedom of choice, whatever. But okay, whatever. We as a collective have decided that whenever you drink and drive, the chances of these sorts of things goes from like regular baseline to like, pew, you're probably gonna kill somebody if you do it enough. Maybe you never will, but anyway, we've decided that because the chances go up so much, as soon as you get in the car drunk, you've already done it. You've already you haven't killed somebody, but you have made the moral choice, the wrong moral choice, and you can be therefore like sanctioned by society because of it. Because you have an understanding that the chances way more go up if you do that. So the point, I still do believe in freedom of choice in that situation, because if you don't have the ability to freely determine what you want, if you can't change what our biology and everything else, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, we're thought of as half man, half angel. So what's that? What's the angel part? That is our ability, which seems unique in the animal world, and I admit freely that we are animals, exist in an animal body. But we also have a dimension that's different. We have a moral dimension where we can kind of see outside of our own needs and make higher level, higher order decisions. And just to finish up, this has gone on way too long, and that last part was a little more incoherent, but basically, I'll just say, I'll end with Voltaire's quote, and I'll modify it. If there were no God, it would be necessary to invent him. My take is, if there were no free will, it would be necessary to invent it. Because thinking of yourself, and, I've been involved with like these Marxist kind of circles or whatever, and they're deterministic too. They're materialist determinists, and believe that the economic system, the superstructure, really has such a huge influence on who you are and what society is like, and who you are as an individual. Which, as I've grown older and I guess become more anarchistic, I less and less kind of like hold to that view. Like my spirit tells me differently, and my felt experience is different. Although I'll admit, felt experience, what's that? Philosophically, it ain't shit. But yeah, if there were no free will, it'd be necessary to invent it, because we've got to live as if we could do otherwise. Because look at all the horrible stuff that's going on in the world. There's people being murdered and raped and killed and destroyed. And if those people were not under any control of their actions, sure, there's extenuating circumstances. Sure, there's trauma. Yes, we ought to rehabilitate and not incarcerate. But I don't think it really does us any good to take the philosophical position that we have no control over our actions. I think there's it explains away too much, and it excuses too much, in my opinion. Could always be wrong. Anyway, yeah, free will, moral responsibility. If there were no free will, it would be necessary to invent it. Peace. Sorry, it did go on long, 29 minutes. Oh.